What happened to Zedekiah as a result of his evil ways? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Kings on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 1 to 7. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Kings chapter 25, beginning at verse 1. Now it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and camped against it. And they built a siege wall against it all around. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine had become so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then the city wall was broken through, and all the men of war fled at night by way of the gate between two walls, which was by the king's garden, even though the Chaldeans were still encamped all around against the city. And the king went by the way of the plain. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king, and they overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his army was scattered from him. So they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and they pronounced judgment on him. Then they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him with bronze fetters, and took him to Babylon. We have now come to the final chapter of our study of 2 Kings. In the last few lessons, we have been looking at the events that occurred after the death of Josiah that led to the Babylonian captivity. Recall that even though Josiah was a righteous king, the people only followed after Josiah's righteousness during Josiah's reign, showing us that their righteousness was not really from the heart. Josiah's father and grandfather had been wicked, as were the 3 sons and 1 grandson that took the throne in Judah in the 22-plus years after Josiah's death. Plus, due to their sins, God fulfilled his words that he had spoken through his prophets who foretold of this captivity. Although numerous prophets would have done so before, the contemporaries at that time who would have done this are the prophets Jeremiah, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk, as well as the prophetess Huldah. Just like with Israel's Assyrian captivity over a century before, Judah's captivity didn't occur all at once. There were really 4 waves of it, of which we have already covered 2. The first wave occurred shortly after Nebuchadnezzar's victory at Carchemish over Pharaoh Necho in 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar advanced against Judah, placing Jehoiakim under tribute and taking away some captives. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have been among this wave of captives, as seen in the book of Daniel. When Jehoiakim rebelled around 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem again, taking Jehoiachin, who by that time had just become king 3 months earlier, along with the royal court and most of the city captive into Babylon. Only the poorest of Jerusalem and Judah remained following this wave of the captivity. People of note taken captive during this wave was the prophet Ezekiel. Jeremiah, though, would remain all the way to the end, prophesying to the final king of Judah, Zedekiah. Zedekiah was the 3rd son of Josiah to reign, and he reigned for 11 years, and like his brothers, was an evil king. Zedekiah was installed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar, likely because Nebuchadnezzar thought that following the captivity of the nobles, Zedekiah wouldn't really have the ability to revolt. On this, Nebuchadnezzar was wrong, for around the 9th year of Zedekiah, he did rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. What prompted this? Well, the book of Jeremiah, as well as secular history, makes it clear that the king of Egypt, who by that time was Psamtik II, followed soon after by his son Apries, the pharaoh that Jeremiah refers to as Hophra, had encouraged Judah to rebel. Now, why would the Egyptians do this? Well, likely it was so that they can control Judah instead of their enemies, the Babylonians. Whatever the case, though, the Egyptians encouraged Zedekiah to revolt, and even attempts to help him against the Babylonians, but Jeremiah records that this failed. After a 3-year siege, and with famine beginning to be so severe in the land, Nebuchadnezzar's army finally broke through the city wall in about 586 BC, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, even though the armies of the Babylonians were still encamped against the city. This is how desperate they were to escape, that they would try to sneak past the Babylonian army, which might result in their death, or face certain death by remaining in the city. Against all odds, they did escape, along with Zedekiah. Since they wound up being captured near Jericho, that tells us that they took one of two routes to escape. They either took the ascent of Adumim, which would be the fastest, and taken them up over the Mount of Olives and on to the famous road that leads to Jericho that we've covered many times in our walk through the Bible. However, that escape route may have been guarded by the Babylonian army, which would have meant that they would have to follow the Kidron Valley to the south before turning east into the Judean wilderness before turning north to go towards Jericho. Whichever way they took, though, the Babylonians caught up with them and scattered what was left of Zedekiah's army, allowing them to take Zedekiah captive. Zedekiah was brought to Nebuchadnezzar in Riblah, which, if you recall from chapter 23, is in Hamath of Syria. Now, if Nebuchadnezzar's army was engaged in siege of Jerusalem, what was he doing this far north? For that, we need to turn to secular history to learn that at the same time, another part of Nebuchadnezzar's army was engaged in a siege in Tyre to the north, making Riblah a convenient place for him to occupy. At Riblah, Nebuchadnezzar pronounced judgment upon Zedekiah for his rebellion. As punishment, Zedekiah got to watch as his sons were killed, after which both his eyes were put out, making this terrible event the last thing Zedekiah saw. Nebuchadnezzar, though, didn't kill Zedekiah, choosing to allow him to suffer as a captive in Babylon. The book of Jeremiah, which gives us much more detail about Zedekiah's reign, tells us that Zedekiah died in prison, though we're not told how long that was. But seeing as how he is a young man here, it could have been quite a while. As for the rest of Jerusalem and Judah, we'll find out what happens to them, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 8 to 21, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.